We are here for a very powerful and moving session. We are so thankful that you all have been able to join us, whether you're watching on Zoom or Facebook Live. We certainly welcome you to what is going to be a night full of really meaningful discussion about how we go forward as a state. My name is Tiara Moultrie, and I am the Policy Associate at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We're here to have a powerful discussion about the devastating impact of student loans on borrowers of color, and particularly on Black borrowers, and what we can do to push for transformation of the student loan system that puts racial justice at the forefront. We'll move quickly through tonight's program to give each of our 5 speakers the opportunity to share their thoughts and expertise with you. We've reserved time for questions and answer at the end, and in just a few minutes, I'll share how you can pose questions for our panelists. The New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, based in the mighty city of Newark, New Jersey, is a racial and social justice advocacy organization that seeks to empower people of color by building reparative systems that create wealth, transform justice, and harness democratic power from the ground up in New Jersey. We advocate for systemic reform that is at once transformative, achievable in the state, and replicable in communities across the nation. To learn more about the Institute, please visit www.njisj.org or follow us on social media. The conversation about student loans is part of our broader work for racial justice in New Jersey, and to meet this moment of increased awareness about the need for racial justice. The Institute recently released 10 ways to do racial justice advocacy. This powerful document highlights the ways that you can do racial justice advocacy in your community, including registering to vote, advocating for youth prison closure, completing the census, and advocating for guaranteed income programs in your city. You can find our 10 Things document on our website, and we'll also include a link to it in both the Zoom and Facebook chats. In the midst of the current pandemic and a growing understanding of the need for systemic change to promote social and racial justice, we see the economic fallout from the public health crisis exacerbating our student loan crisis. The $1.6 trillion national student loan debt has limited economic mobility for students, with Black and other students of color bearing the greatest burdens. And not only are Black and other students of color most harmed by higher education spending cuts, which result in thousands of dollars in unmet need and a greater reliance on student loans, but repaying these loans post-graduation remains an uphill battle for Black students who earn less directly out of college than their peers. For too long, we've allowed Black and other students of color, as well as their families, to languish in a cycle of insurmountable debt. As elected officials at the state and national level debate how to respond to the deepening crisis within a crisis, we must push for bold, equitable, and inclusive policy solutions. One innovative reform being discussed at the national level is, of course, debt forgiveness. Citing our recently released working paper, co-authored with our panelist, Dr. Shapiro, which we'll include in the Zoom and Facebook chats, Senator Schumer and Warren introduced a resolution detailing how the next president should use existing executive authority to decrease student loan debt. Tonight's panel is taking place before a unique backdrop. The pandemic has created economic uncertainty and exposed the cracks of structural racism throughout the state and the nation. With little more than a month before the presidential election, we have the opportunity to take proactive steps to repair our state and build a new foundation. New Jersey has the largest racial wealth gap in the country, in which the average white family has a median net worth of $352,000, compared to just $6,100 and $7,300 respectively for Black and Latino families. These stark differences in family wealth translate into enormous disparities for students by race and ethnicity, and their financial need for college, and in their ability to pay off their student loans. Our panelists tonight will help us to understand the realities of student loan borrowers in today's overlapping student loan and public health crises, particularly Black borrowers, and help us to identify how we can work in these challenging times to create the change we want to see. Recently, the Institute released our report, Freed from Debt, a racial justice approach to student loan reform in New Jersey, which can be seen here and is also available on our website. Like all of the other links, we'll be sure to include it in the chat. The report examines the national student loan crisis, highlights the disproportionate impact of student loan debt on New Jersey's Black and other borrowers of color, and introduces 4 powerful policy proposals to free New Jersey borrowers from the burden of debt. Our bold proposals, which aim to end the crisis in higher education that has left millions of borrowers in debt and default, include tuition-free college and loan forgiveness. The findings and proposals in our report are part of our broad effort to create opportunity and repair harm in our communities across all of the intersecting areas of our work. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists who will speak to these issues and more over the next hour. First, Shannon Miller is a New Jersey resident and management professional who will speak about her experiences with student loan borrowing. In addition, we are joined by Dr. Tom Shapiro, the David R. Pockros Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Mark Hulsman, Associate Director of Policy and Research at Demos, and Beverly Brown-Ruggia, the Financial Justice and Community Reinvestment Act organizer at New Jersey Citizen Action. We're so pleased to have this distinguished panel and look forward to each of our panelists' remarks and to hearing from our audience during the Q&A portion. Throughout the panel, please feel free to share your questions by typing them into the Facebook Live or Zoom chat features. We'll get to as many questions as possible within the allotted time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed panelists, beginning with Shannon. These introductions and opening remarks will be followed by some brief questions and then, of course, our Q&A. Shannon.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me, Tiara, and the New Jersey Social Justice Institute. Very happy to be here and share my experience as a student loan recipient. I have a little bit of a non-traditional relationship with debt than several of my peers beginning in high school. I am a native of Camden, New Jersey, and so had the honor of attending a very prestigious high school where I received a scholarship. During that time, I would later learn that my parents took out loans so that I could join in all of the activities that come with being in a prestigious post-secondary education institute. And so things that included just study abroad trips or any extracurriculars outside of room and board had to be covered by parents. And that was the introduction of the loans. I wouldn't be privy to that upon decision for college, but that is a little bit of where our family's relationship with loan and borrowing begins as far as my education. From there, I chose to go to an HBCU versus a few schools that I had a full financial scholarship to. And so instead of going to a state school, I wanted to really go to an institution that stood by values and could offer me relationships that I felt other schools couldn't. But with that, we know that HBCUs or historically Black institutions sometimes don't receive the same financial packages that other schools do. So I began borrowing there. For the first 2 years, my parents did loans in their names. For the latter half of my education, I would begin to take on the loans in my name. And so during that time, there's also internships, which is a big portion of being in business school. If you don't take on the internships, then you kind of don't get the full business school experience. And with that, I took on an unpaid internship because I wanted to pursue the intersection of fashion and business. It's what several people were doing at the time. In order to take that unpaid internship, I would later have to take on loans. This is where the private loans began. So I had at this time, we now have my parents doing the federal loans, and I began taking private loans just to support internship opportunities or anything outside, once again, of just what's normally included in what people look at as financial costs for college. During this time in the second portion, we start to see as I move towards looking into graduate education. This is where I had more of an opportunity. I have been paying back my loans at this point for about 10 years or so. Sorry, I think so, around 10 years or so. And this is where I really began to see how how my loans were going to shape my future decisions. And so instead of pursuing more prestigious schools, I really looked at the options of I was, where I would be least financially impacted, and opted to go to a state school versus another business school that I had gotten into, more so because of that experience. I looked at the costs and evaluated, did I want to spend $80,000 on graduate education, or could I do it for 15 per year? I also, at this point, in interest of not taking on a large amount of debt, I sought out relationships that my employer at the time offered, as far as loan paybacks and other employment opportunities that they offered that helped me to pay for my graduate education. But it's a conversation that I'm happy to be a part of here, because I really see where my loans have impacted my ability to truly gain the most from everything, as far as my actual income, when I have to factor that into literally daily decisions. Every decision that I make going forward is impacted by the fact that I have this amount that I have to pay back each month. So that's just a little bit about my relationship with loans.
Thank you, Shannon. And as mentioned, we'll be hearing from each of our panelists again in a more thorough sort of question and answer session a little later. Tom?
Great, thank you. And welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I really want to thank Shannon for anchoring the conversation in how an aggregate problem really impacts an individual. And they're just, unfortunately, there are millions of Shannon stories out there. So I want to do a little bit of level setting, if you will. And I want to first talk a little bit about racial wealth inequalities in the United States at a national level. And the quick level setting that I think is important for this webinar is that when we look at family wealth, that is everything of financial value that a family owns, minus all of its debts, including home mortgages and obviously including student loans and other loans as well. The typical white family at the middle, right at the median, has about $171,000 in wealth, lower than the New Jersey total, but this is about the nation as a whole. So that's $171,000 for a white family nationally. For an African-American family, it's about a little over $17,000. So you see the African-American family has about a dime in wealth for every dollar of wealth that the typical white family has. And for a Latinx family, it's about $21,000, a bit better, if you will, than the African-American number, but considerably lower than the white median. That's a national snapshot at sort of one point in time that the representative national data captures for us. We've also done work that follows the same set of families. We've not done the actual interviews, but from a panel study of income dynamics that followed the same set of families. In this case from 1984, which is the first time the study asked about family wealth, and followed those families every few years. The latest data point is about 2018 or so. And what that shows is that the racial wealth inequality, just measured black-white, in 1984 opens up at $84,000. 21 years later, if you will, that racial wealth inequality from $84,000 has grown to $256,000. So when we get to really dig down to the issue and the challenge at hand here, contemporary dynamics, including student debt loan, plays a large role in what we're talking about here. The second bit of ground setting that I would like to do has to do with what I call the higher education financing regime. And I think from my point of view, the first thing to note is the incredible transformation that we as a society have made from basically public investment for higher education up into the 1950s and 1960s, and that has dwindled and transitioned to a system that is essentially privately financed by. So the risk of the financial burden, if you will, moved from a public good to an individual debt or wealth extraction to pay tuition and other costs involved. And I was looking just actually a couple of days ago at a piece of data that captures this really well for me. Between 2003 and the end of the first quarter in 2020, and this data is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, student debt loan, the change in the balance of student debt loan grew 356% adjusted for inflation. That is in real money. It increased 356% from 2003 up to the current day. Now, that compares with an increase in the balance in mortgages for everybody that increased about 40%. Credit card debt went down about 15%. So what I would like people to get a sense of there is the scope and the magnitude, how important student debt loan has become to household wealth balances, particularly on the debt side. But that's not just an aggregate issue or an aggregate problem, if you will. We did a study that looked at, with administrative data, that looked at student debt after 20 years after students entered college. And that may be, the Shannons of the world. She's probably not out 20 years yet, but some of her maybe slightly older cohorts, 20 years out. White student borrowers have paid off 95% of the balance of their student debt loans. African-American student borrowers still owe 95% of their student loans. And that really gets at, for me, the policy and the structural dynamic of you need wealth in the first place to help to pay tuition. You need to come from a family that can help with that tuition and the other expenses that Shannon pointed out that go along with attending higher education. And clearly from all the data we look at, white families have much more financial capacity because of what they were allowed to earn and save and grow wealth in the past compared to African American families today. So the last point I would like to end with before we move it on, and I really encourage questions about any of this particular sets of data that I'm citing here. The last piece that I want to throw out is that it's not just a problem about wealth extraction. It's also an issue around accessibility and the nature of who goes to what kinds of institutions of higher education. And for me, the smoking gun piece of data here is that among the elite Ivy League colleges, plus a few others like the MITs of the world, 15% of the student body comes from the top 1% of income earners. 15% from the top 1% of income earners, while 13.5% at those institutions come from the bottom 50% of the income distribution, that is their families. And that tells us a lot about the high finances, the student debt, and frankly, the process of college admissions. So I want to thank everybody again, and I am going to turn this over to Tiara for the next presentation.
Thank you, Tom. I want to, of course, recognize our next panelist who unfortunately was missed in the intro, but I am so happy that we have joining us Professor Emeritus, or Dean Emeritus, Dr. Walter Greason from Monmouth University, who's here to share a few thoughts with us about, one, being from New Jersey and the impact that we see on the racial wealth gap here in the state, and also from his role in the university, what the larger impact is on students in particular.
Thank you so much, Tiara, and don't worry, I can be invisible in some circumstances, not in this one. I think folks knew I was coming through. So thank you. This is an extraordinary opportunity, and especially to follow Dr. Shapiro's research. The pieces on the racial wealth gap, I'm going to try and circle back and tie into in a moment. But I spent a lot of years teaching economic history at Monmouth. And I want to talk a little bit about those stories and how they impacted the way students across my career didn't understand the way debt functioned as they borrowed it to complete their undergraduate degrees, and then further when they went on to professional school and expanded their debt load. So I want to start with a basic exercise that my undergraduate students have done for almost 20 years, is where I would have them reflect on, I guess one of the key points is Dr. Shapiro raises the top 1% of earners in the United States. And what does that actually mean in terms of dollars? Because it changes. Inflation changes what that number is every 4 to 7 years. And so looking at that, my students, on the first day I asked them, in your 3 best years of your career, what do you hope to earn? What will be your average salary in your 3 best earning years? And I have them write the answer down. And then I don't ask them to share it or disclose it. But we end up talking as a class about all the different perceptions of what it means to earn a high income. And I'll say fully 80% of my students say that their best 3 years come in at about $100,000 a year. In their best years, they think the most they can make is $100,000. Now, the outlier are my finance students. They are at the other end of the spectrum. They say they expect to earn $3 million a year for their three best years. And then when they start to talk about this as a class, they start to see, like, how could you possibly expect to earn that much money? And it's just understanding the way the money works in the United States is very different based on your family background, the community you come from. And that then impacts the way student loan debt and the way people think about borrowing after they've completed their FAFSA. So debt-wise, when you're not expecting to make a ton of money, or your perception of a ton of money is skewed. At the low end, I have students who come out feeling very burdened by $50,000 in student loan debt. And sometimes with private borrowing rates, they end up having to pay double or triple the principal amount back over their lifetimes. And so it's horrendous. They're paying back $150,000 on $50,000 in loans, and it cripples their lives. And that's where I'm going to close. But at the other end, I have folks who borrow in excess of $250,000, both undergraduate and graduate school. But then there's a strategy that they undertake about leveraging their future earnings to then aggressively pay off their debts within 10 to 15 years after completing their graduate degree. And these are folks who are typically engineers or architects or doctors. They have very, very high paying jobs, and they basically underwrote their 7 or 8 years of education to try and put together that loan package. But no one discloses that. There's no handbook to walk people through, okay, if you're a sociology major, how much do you borrow? What kind of career should you undertake? How should you expect to pay that off over the course of your working life? Those conversations are crucial and the center of what we really need to accomplish to help people like Shannon, to help all of us really understand the role of debt in the American economy. And that's where I want to spend a little bit more time this evening. So to get there, I want to see if I can share my screen. Hope everybody can see that. This is a basic image from a group who has picked up on a lot of work I've done for the last 10 years called Visual Capitalist. They're essentially making lots of market-based arguments about social problems around the world. I frankly disagree with them 90% of the time, but this is one of the places where I thought it could be a compelling visual to build on our conversation tonight. And so it talks about asset types held by race. And that's where I really want to take everybody within the kind of conversation about debt, is that if you're carrying a debt load that you don't know how to manage, or it starts to multiply on you, it prevents you from entering into this conversation. about what you should use money for, and how do you actually begin to accumulate assets over the course of your life. And so the statistics here are not my main point. What I wanted to really show you at the minimum is this first line, primary residence, where it says for a white household, 73% of their wealth is coming from their primary residence. And this is what drew me to the topic initially, is that the disparities that you see for Black households or Hispanic households, Asian, Indigenous households, these disparities, these red areas, are largely a product of different levels of segregation and the way steering happens and the kinds of loans and insurance that are underwritten by our financial institutions. And that made me really sensitive to an incident that happened with my students this past year during the midst of COVID, is that institutions, when they decide on your financial aid burden, how much you have to borrow to attend school, they rely on formulas to kind of calculate your need and then figure out how much you need to borrow and then figure out the rate at which you're going to be charged to pay back. Those tools, those actuarial formulas are what we need to kind of critique to figure out how debt multiplies on vulnerable households, especially Black and Hispanic households. And so we can go through and look at the way that a vehicle constitutes someone's net worth, retirement accounts. The big one I would love to talk more about tonight are family-owned businesses and the way that equity contributes to wealth, and ultimately publicly traded stock. These last two categories fuel, even if you're starting to be successful and pay off your debt, you're never going to really close the racial wealth gap with these last two disparities. And so my last point for you all is we need to recalculate the way income, debt, and wealth accumulation works in the United States. Is that the formulas that we use through the Federal Reserve System, through the private banking system, they guarantee that these inequalities are not just going to continue, but they're going to accelerate in terms of how wide they are. And so until we start to recalculate the way we want our economy to work, we're not going to see any progress to try and eliminate debt and help people accumulate wealth. Thank you.
I think I'm up. Hi everybody. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice for convening this really interesting panel. I've already learned a lot being a later person to speak, and I think some of my remarks will definitely touch on a lot of what folks have already said, and hopefully build upon some of the research and lived experience in the case of Shannon that we've seen and that's contributed to the discussion around the student debt crisis. So I actually want to start by saying that the economy that we now face and the situation facing families or students or borrowers in New Jersey and elsewhere, it's not like the weather, right? It's not something that just sort of happened to people, but it's actually the result of decades, if not centuries, of policy choices, of action and often inaction on the part of federal and state policy lawmakers, institutional leaders, and those in power, right? And I say that to say that we're facing sort of an unprecedented time in our economy and in our country, but that nationwide and in New Jersey in particular, Black and brown students and Black and brown borrowers faced a student debt crisis before COVID-19 ever hit. And as with so much in our economy, often face and must face an often intentionally confusing, complex, and certainly insufficient set of policies that make up our higher education system and beyond. And some of the panelists have already touched on this, but it is important to note that in the past 30 years, New Jersey public higher education funding on a per student level has declined by almost half. It's declined by about 43%, and in the gap has filled tuition. Right, tuition has nearly tripled on average in that time. The state used to kick in most of the cost of educating students in the public higher education system. Used to kick in about 80% of the cost actually, and now it covers less than half. And as the student population has grown more diverse, as we've had more people sort of knocking on the door of higher ed, we have left students to fend for themselves in a higher education system and in an economy where wages have been largely stagnant. We've faced multiple once-in-a-lifetime recessions, which is, I thought we'd only get one, but we've gotten more than one. As an older millennial, it tends to make me kind of angry. But for the past few decades, this has coincided and sort of as a cause and a consequence of rising student debt. So, the state disinvestment is in New Jersey and certainly elsewhere across the country is a really big piece of this, that what was once thought of as a public good, where you could attend by paying for it with a part-time job or a summer job or something like that, often is now almost primarily debt financed for all but the wealthiest students, or the luckiest students, I should say. And for the past few decades at the federal level, instead of focusing on this problem of disinvestment, instead of focusing on reducing debt or lowering the amount of debt people have to pay for college, the federal government has actually seen its role in just making debt easier to repay. So, we've seen the proliferation of policies that allow you to repay your loans based on your monthly income. Shannon was alluding to that. We see options that the federal government provides to maybe defer some of your payments, provide loan forgiveness after 20 years of repaying debt, or 10 years in an overly complex public service loan forgiveness program. Extremely confusing to navigate, kind of hard to deal with, even for the most sort of financially savvy person. And at the end of the day, it doesn't reduce debt. It just sort of helps you, get by month to month, hopefully. And that's because policymakers, this is why I started with thinking about choices here. Policymakers haven't traditionally viewed student debt as anywhere near a major problem. In fact, on the contrary, there's a lot of, talk from policymakers up until recently about it actually being a good thing that just sort of needs to be managed in the first few years out of school. And I would submit that this has been a pretty disastrous assumption and built on a fundamental misunderstanding of a lot of things, but particularly how racism shows up in our economy. Black and brown students in particular are more likely to need to borrow for college, more likely to need to take on debt, face economic headwinds in the job market, structural racism in the housing market, plenty of other experiences that make an additional debt burden often harder to repay. And some of our research has shown that the consequences are pretty dire. For Black men, 12 years after starting school, about half will default on a student loan 12 years after starting school. For Black women, 12 years after starting school, the typical Black female borrower owes more debt than she originally took on for college. This is a crisis that predated COVID. And obviously, a lot of this, in terms of Walter's remarks and Tom's remarks, this is a result and a consequence and a contributor to, frankly, the racial wealth gap in this country. And in the midst of the pandemic, that we're in now, and in the economic crisis that it is foisted upon us, the federal government has paused student debt payments and frozen interest first through September, through the CARES Act, and now through the end of the year. And this was, a necessary step, I would argue, but it's actually insufficient to help, the people who are struggling most with student loans. Pausing monthly payments is very different from canceling student debt. And in all likelihood, when the faucet gets turned back on, when Congress forces people, or the administration forces people to start making their payments again, they're likely to do so well before the time it takes for people to get back on their feet, in terms of their own economic and financial circumstances. It doesn't help people to reduce the balance when you're not reducing their balance on their debt. It doesn't make them necessarily less likely to default in the future. And the last thing I would say, before opening up to I believe Beverly, is that this problem has to be solved inside and outside our higher education policy. That means investing in public institutions. That means investing in HBCUs and the students who are doing the lion's share of educating Black and brown students in this country. But it also means housing relief. It means raising wages. It means getting people out from under the crushing cost of childcare. It means sort of a federal-state partnership in a bunch of different areas, working together to invest, not only to help the current generation of borrowers facing this heavy burden, but also that future generations never have to experience this again.
Thank you, Mark. So my name is Beverly Brown Ruja, and as Chiara said, I'm the financial justice organizer for New Jersey Citizen Action. And I think that so much has been said that really explains and draws and paints the environment and the crisis that the environment we're in and the crisis that we're looking at. And so from a financial justice perspective, which always has an overlay of racial justice, something that was in the report to me is kind of the bottom line and sort of encapsulates everything that's been said. It's sort of, this outcome really says it all. And that statistic in the Institute for Social Justice paper is this one. It says that in 20 years, a white student loan borrower is likely to pay down about 94% of his or her loan, while a Black student is likely to pay only 5% in that same amount of time on his or her student debt. So as somebody who looks at disparities in lending, discrimination in lending, and unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices in lending, this is a red flag. We know why students are borrowing so much. We know why Black and brown students have to borrow more. We know why it takes longer for them to pay that down. But what do we do right now? We at Citizen Action agree with the Institute that we need to be working towards free college. We need to be working towards forgiveness. But in this moment, we know that across the country, student loan borrowers owe $1.6 trillion. In the state of New Jersey, it's more than $40 billion. And we have to look at that situation right now. So with that staggering statistic hanging over in our heads and in the background that everyone has provided, let's just hold all that for a minute. So we know, and Mark has actually just talked about this in TR a lot, we know we're in the middle of this crisis, and that there were some provisions put in place, and there's forbearance, and that's going to lift. And we're going to come back to where we were before COVID with the same amount of debt and more, actually. We also know that there are other, in the general debt crisis, there's a number of exacerbating problems. And that one of the biggest problems was the history of loan servicing companies. So people have to take out this debt because of the cost of tuition. Black and brown people have to take out more because of historic racism. But we had this history of loan servicers making that debt worse. So they were guilty of unfair and deceptive practices that included things like not letting borrowers know about the best repayment plans, not telling borrowers about the public service loan forgiveness program, misapplying payments. And so these were practices that were exacerbating the problem that we already had. Another area that we're looking into much more now in New Jersey, and people are across the nation, and that is the role of for-profit schools, which the Institute talks about in its report. And that is that students at for-profit schools are overwhelmingly low-income, people of color, women, and they face disproportionate rates of default and take on more there's loan debt, and in many cases are not completing the degrees they need to get the jobs to pay back that debt. So those are some of the big exacerbating points that we have to deal with, have had to deal with. And so I bring them up because I was asked to talk about what's being done about the crisis in New Jersey up to now. So we still have a lot more to do, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But I just wanted to talk about a few things that have been done, and it's been fairly recently, and they're key because they get at some of the core issues that I just mentioned. So in the summer of 2019, New Jersey passed a package of bills. One included something called the Student Loan Ombudsman and Loan Servicer Act. And that bill requires that any loan servicer in the state of operating or providing loans, managing loans in the state of New Jersey has to be registered with the Department of Banking and Insurance. And the Department of Banking and Insurance by law must establish standards of conduct, and they have the ability to enforce those standards and hold services accountable. And so that gets to some of those what I call UDAP practices, unfair deceptive practices. If servicers are found to treat their borrowers badly, deceive them in any way, they can be held accountable by the Department of Banking and Insurance. Another issue we have in the state, of course, is making sure that students have someone that they can go to if they have a problem with a servicer. And so the bill also calls for establishing the Office of a Student Loan Ombudsman where they can take their problems. And that the first phase of that, implementing that law is due to take place or go into effect on October 1st. So we'll be looking to see what the Department of Banking and Insurance puts out for students to be able to repair to when they have problems. Another bill, another set of bills dealt with the higher education student assistance authorities, NJ class loans. As many of you know, the federal loans, and Shannon spoke to this and others spoke to this, students can rarely cover all of their costs of going for tuition and going to school with federal loans, and they take out private loans. And so the state does offer one private loan through the Department of, through the Higher Education Assistance Authority, and they're called NJ class loans. They're like the Parent Plus loan on the federal level. And they, in 2019, HESA actually implemented some administrative changes to establish two programs that provide alternate payment options. They're called the Repayment Assistance Program and the Assistant Repayment Plans, the Household Income Assistant Repayment Plan, or HARP. Additionally, the HESA implemented, or bill was passed that codified something that HESA had been doing, which allowed borrowers and cosigners who had defaulted to essentially rehabilitate and start paying again so that they get out of default status. And then a fourth law that was passed that summer required higher institutions of higher education to provide students full transparency in terms of tuition and fees by providing a financial aid, what's called shopping sheet, so that students and their families understood exactly what their financial aid packages provided and what they would be responsible for. As I said, this package of bills was really just a start, and the state of New Jersey has to do much more. But these bills and some others that have come down the road are beginning to get at what I call the programs that are meant to stop harm that's being done. Students have loans that they have to deal with. They're going to have to repay them until, of course, we can get some kind of stronger forgiveness programs for them. But in the meantime, the state is going to have to help students repay their loans more efficiently.
Thank you, Beverly, and to all of our panelists. So as you can see, we have a great wealth of knowledge on this panel, and as a result of that, we are actually looking to move to the Q&A section. So I see that many people have begun already sharing questions with us in the chat. We will get to as many questions as possible, both from the Zoom and the Facebook Live. I think we will begin with the question that came in most recently. Do you think existing loan cancellation and repayment programs like income-based repayments offer a viable pathway to a debt-free future, particularly for Black borrowers? I think we've talked a little bit about the fact that Black borrowers are taking on larger amounts of debt as a result of them having less access to wealth. So how do these programs actually create, if at all, a pathway towards, one, debt freedom and being actually absolved of student loan debt? And for borrowers of color who are particularly struggling right out of school when they're making less money, how do these programs serve to help them? Mark?
I knew you were going to come to me first. It's a great question because, you know, there's this sort of alphabet soup of federal and sometimes state programs that, you know, are intended, you know, their intention is to help people manage their debt, you know, and there's been some bipartisan support for some of these programs. The problem is from my vantage point, as I alluded to before, is that there are very few programs that actually help people eliminate their debt. on a very quick time frame, right? You have federal income-based repayment programs that make your monthly payments sort of align with your income, but you don't see any forgiveness. And if you have debt after 20 years of repaying, then you see some forgiveness. If not, you're just sort of managing month to month for as long as you can hack it. And I think that's a problem. That's a problem for a couple of reasons. One, it sort of assumes that most people in college are the sort of what you think of as a traditional 18 to 22-year-old has the whole, their whole career ahead of them. There are a lot of adult students out there. The typical college-going student is not an 18 to 22-year-old. It's actually an older student. It's an older borrower. Maybe they're dealing with their own financial burdens. Maybe they're trying to save for college for their kids. So asking them to repay debt for 20 years before seeing any relief is a pretty heavy burden. So I think that there really needs to be some imagination around canceling debt. There was talk in the presidential primary, however many months, years, decades ago, about how much debt to cancel, if any. There are proposals in Congress from $10,000 to $30,000 to $50,000 for everyone. And I think that we can be creative with this, right? We can cancel all debt, and if we need to pay for it through higher taxes on wealthy folks, I think we should do that. But we can talk about some debt cancellation for all and all for some, and that you have additional debt cancellation for those who are in debt and enrolled in public assistance programs, right? Unemployment insurance, SNAP, TANF, you name it, that where we can sort of target borrowers that are sort of, by definition struggling, and also provide broad-based relief. But I think that the current set of policies that we have is not going to get us where we need to be. And frankly, we've had these policies for a while, and student debt is in the $1.6 to $1.7 trillion number range when I was coming out of college, many years ago now, it was only about $200 billion. So it's, the current policies have not been enough to mitigate the crisis, I would say.
Thank you, Mark. And I think that definitely leaves open one, the reason why we need more progressive solutions. So we see these state actions that are taking place when we see sort of incremental change that's happening, but really in terms of addressing the large amount of debt that borrowers are still holding, we need bolder action. So things like, for example, free tuition college, which I know Mark has also written extensively about, and really is part of that same national conversation that student loan debt forgiveness is. We need to see these put into place in places like New Jersey, where we see that really people are taking on an immense debt specifically because of such high rates of tuition. New Jersey has the third highest rate of in-state tuition, sort of after you've exhausted all your financial aid. And so when we think about what that means for people, I think that we definitely need something that focuses more on the racial inequities that exist in the state. And I think that's also a great segue to one of the other questions that we have in the chat. I'm going to read the question and then actually open it up to Walter and Tom. So a long history of discriminatory policies and practices have resulted in borrowers of color, and especially Black borrowers, experiencing worse outcomes related to student loan debt and default. What can we do to hold states responsible for enacting progressive solutions? So we've talked about some of those possible policy solutions in terms of free tuition, debt forgiveness. Here at the Institute, we're also advocating for the creation of a reparations task force, legislation that you can also see listed in our 10 Things document, which I've included in the chat. But I'd really like to open it up first to Walter and then Tom to talk a little bit about what progressive solutions can look like and how do we hold leaders accountable, especially for Walter here in New Jersey.
So there's a couple things. I'm juggling a couple things at home this instant, but I want to say very quickly, housing. The way that the housing market has evolved and the embedded nature of discrimination within the housing market, that's a lot of the wealth that other, particularly white households, use to underwrite the way students go to college, the way they're able to manage their debt load. Black and Latino households can't count on that in the same way. Their housing stock does not appreciate, it's not considered as valuable, and in fact can often depreciate when they happen to be homeowners. And so it compounds the debt cycle in ways that are really troubling. So doing more to intervene in the housing market and to provide equity in the housing market can go some way towards providing a better foundation.
Thank you. So let me build a little bit from Walter. I'm glad we're making the student debt and racial community segregation connection, and those dots are really close together, and it doesn't take a whole lot to draw that connection. I think I tend to start with the place that, as Walter mentioned before, that the wealth of America's middle class between the 20th and the 60th percentile is not in savings or stocks and bonds. It's the result of deep institutional structures and policies around the housing market and the way that we finance housing and the way that we give in the tax code money back, basically a subsidy for home ownership, arguably for families that can already afford it through the mortgage interest tax deduction. And the ways in which, because of the more expensive the home, the higher the mortgage, the higher the subsidy, the higher the tax rate, the bulk of it goes to relatively well-off white families. And there's a lot of data. There are mountains of data that tell us that. If we were to think of a progressive housing policy that said, well, maybe this isn't an individual phenomenon because that's not the way the wealth is created. What if we thought about it as a housing policy, as standard, safe housing for everybody, and everybody gets the same amount of federal support, whether they're owners or renters, for housing. Housing is housing. Shouldn't make a difference of how wealthy it is, or it's a McMansion, or whether it's a trailer. And that's one way in which a system like that can begin to be leveled. The other thing I would just mention quickly, because it really does help to tie the dots together here. The prime reason that African Americans and others say that they're not homeowners is student debt. And that comes from studies, a deep study done by the realty industry. You know, they want to get rid of student debt too, because they want that money in the terms of down payments. And there may be some unlikely allies in the struggle moving forward, but that helps us to tie the connection between housing and student debt. Student debt is essentially, in my view, wealth extraction.
Thank you, Tom. So Beverly, I actually have a question for you. I appreciate you really grounding it in the Garden State level and also talking a little bit about predatory lending and for-profit institutions. With that, I'm hoping that given the uncertainty of this challenging moment, you can walk us through a little bit of what consumer protections can be put in place at the local and national level to defend students, and particularly students of color, from predatory for-profit colleges or other actors and servicers as we face the economic fallout. So obviously we know that only people who have federal student loans are currently in forbearance. A great number of people are still continuing to struggle as they try to qualify for economic hardship forbearance, or simply paying their student loans and really doing without. So I'm hoping you can lift that up in this particular moment about why this is so important and what we can do to protect consumers in New Jersey.
Sure. I just want to say very quickly, at the federal level, we actually had a number of policies in place in the previous administration that were getting at, again, some of these problems. There was a gainful employment rule, which meant that for-profit schools in particular were being held to a standard in terms of making sure that their programs were leading to gainful employment. Their graduates were getting the skills and the education they needed in order to get the jobs that would, A, get them a living wage, but also presumably help them pay back whatever debt they had for the tuition. Unfortunately, that rule was overturned by the current administration, and so that's a problem. There is also something called the borrower defense rule, which means when students were, a school, for-profit school might abruptly close and the student was left with nothing, they had the opportunity to seek, they were able to apply for forgiveness for that loan. So we had some federal, and there are a few other things as well. We had federal programs that were in place. There's the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which again, it's a Band-Aid, but it was something that would help people. All of those, that has not been implemented well, and certain things have been overturned. They're not implementing the borrower defense rule, and the gainful employment rule was overturned. So if we can get to a place where we're enforcing some of those things, and then adding on to what you said in terms of some of the state recommendations at the federal level, we at Citizen Action, we believe that there should be forgiveness, as somebody said, all for some and some for all. and also looking at investing in public education so that we're bringing down the costs in general. So that is the federal level. The state level, again, we are, and I'm not going to run through those because some of it's repetitive, but we are looking at doing some of the same kinds of things at the state level. There is currently a bill, Senate bill, that would provide a gainful employment standard at the state level. And we also have a bill that, and actually it would take it a step further. It wouldn't just look at sort of debt to income ratio. It would look at cost, the cost of of a program in relation to what the Department of Labor knows is a potential, potential income for whatever degree or certificate the person is getting. We're also looking at, protecting people from other kinds of abuses in this industry. There are a number of forced arbitration clauses in contracts. And what that means is students may go to a school that doesn't deliver what they've paid for, but they sign away their rights to hold that, to have a day in court and take that school to court. So we are looking at a way to, there's a federal, we can't ban forced arbitration in the state, but we're looking at a way to divest from any kind of program that requires that. We don't want to invest state money in a program that requires that. And we are also looking at, there's a bill that's been introduced that looks at tighter oversight of private loans, making sure that there's more ways to pay back the loans more efficiently, again, that kind of a thing. And so, Tara, those are, again, a lot of Band-Aids, and I know that in the paper you called for doing much more loan forgiveness, certainly through HESA. And one of the problems with that is that HESA doesn't use state money. HESA goes to the market and is bonded through the market. And so one of the things we're advocating for is a public bank, where we would like, not like, we wouldn't do the student loan program the same way that they do in North Dakota. They actually charge almost the same as they do in terms of interest rates on the street there. But what we would like to see is that the state invest in loans, could be through HESA, at a much lower rate, so that, and we pass on the savings to the students, get rid of the high cost private loans. And again, I want to emphasize that we certainly believe that the federal loans are the best. They should raise the cap. We should do forgiveness. We should invest in free college. But while we have the lending system in place, we need to make sure that students are not charged exorbitant interest rates in the private loan industry, and we need to make sure they're not abused by the servicing industry that manages the federal loans. So it's a combination of dealing with what's going on now and looking at some innovations. And we would argue that we need to start investing state money in many different ways in higher education. So whether it's through much lower cost loans from a public bank or backed by a public bank, or it is investing directly in higher ed so that tuition comes down. We need to be thinking much more about possibilities and changing the whole structure of paying for higher education. And that, of course, because Black and brown students are most negatively impacted by the current system, that means we're looking at this through a racial justice lens.
Beverly, thank you so much. I think one of the things that we really try to highlight in the student loan report is the fact that we do need to make increased investments, especially during this current moment. We have to take progressive action that's going to be impactful and really reach Black and brown borrowers. And as much as we talk about the state investing in loans or investing in higher education, this is really an example of New Jersey investing in its residents. And I think that's a great segue to also end with the person who we started with. So Shannon. We've heard a lot about how student loans impact people in the long term, and you graciously shared your story with us. I'm hoping that you'll also talk about the major financial milestones in your life that have been impacted by student loans and how you feel your experiences compare to your peers with little or no debt. And I think with that, we'll be able to really paint a full picture about what this means in a very tangible way for New Jersey residents.
Yeah, I wish I had the opportunity to sit in on this conversation some 15 years ago, which would have reframed the trajectory of my life quite honestly, it puts you in a category. I'd say most impactful would be career decisions, especially at a time now where, you know, there is a call to just really stand by all the things that you believe in, but also taking a look at where you have to be income wise. It's, you know, you have a business degree. Are you going to be able to support yourself, family members who may call on you, given all of the other issues that impact Black and Brown people? Or are you going to be able to, you know, can you truly step back and take a job that pays you less than X amount of dollars? And I think when you're dealing with down the barrel of loans each month, certain things do not become an option for you. They're just, options don't exist. And I think that's been the biggest portion. When it comes down to housing, you're literally choosing between going in and taking on additional loans to purchase the home in addition to where you are. And I think also just overall wellness, as far as when you look at where you're stacked up against your peers and you know that you're not in the same place. My income for a peer who makes the same thing is not the same as what I have to do with it, because now, you know, as a renter, you are sometimes paying more as a renter because that's the nature of the game. And then you're sitting with loans. And so, you know, you can both come in, as Walter talked about, as far as like making that dream number. And it does not mean nearly the same thing as it would when you look at it on levels, especially when you're talking about living in New Jersey, New York, Philadelphia area. It's just not, you know, $100,000 sounds very dreamy. But when you start putting in the cocktail of rent, loans, and just everyday needs, it does not pace out. So I think when we talk about how it's impacted overall, it is every pivotal moment, from ownership and being able to attain a certain level of wealth that was promised, which is why you took on the loans. And I think that's the overall theme here. You take on something, you take on the loans with an idea of promise and a dream, and then it becomes something completely different. And, you know, everyone's story changes, but I think that's where it lands.
Thank you, Shannon. So we are at 7:04, and we are going to try to stick as close as possible to closing in the next few minutes, but I do want to give each of our panels the opportunity to wrap up in a sentence or two, just some takeaways for our audience. We know that there are lots of people watching who are borrowers themselves, whether they have student loans that they're continuing to pay off 10 or 20 years later, or they've taken on student loan debt to support their children. I'm hoping that you can leave us with some parting words and maybe some actionable items as well that will help carry us through the next few months and the next year, really. And so we think about what it means to carry student loans and also that growing burden for Black and Brown borrowers with, again, forbearance continuing for another 2 months or 3 months, and then people being back in the same situation they were pre-COVID. So really, how do we treat the symptoms of this illness that we're dealing with now as we talk about being in these two intertwined crises? I guess we will follow the order that is currently on my screen. So Beverly, Mark, Shannon, Walter, and Tom, you'll have the last word.
Thank you. As an advocate, you know, I will continue to work to get policies in place that try to protect students from the situation that they're in now, help them deal with the loans that they have, and also advocate to get rid of the root causes of this problem, which is the cost of education and the way we finance it. But I also want to say, as an organizer, Shannon, it's hearing from people like you that is the most valuable and most important thing that we have in fighting this crisis. I always say that, you know, the student loan debt crisis doesn't amount to dreams deferred. It amounts to dreams destroyed and lives destroyed. And I think we all know, and I think Tom and Walter especially really outlined the fact that there's so many external factors that we have to deal with, housing, redlining, all of that. But in this moment, I think we need to lift the voices of students like Shannon. And I don't want to be negative, but we need to shame our leadership. They need to invest in the people of this state. National leaders need to invest in the people of this country, and live up to the promises that were made. So I just want to end with, I think, is Shannon, if you and as many people who are going through what you're going through can speak out, we have a chance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Beverly's saying. I think you can't overestimate lived experience and how that can shape policy in really amazing ways. So the more that we can create solidarity across race, class, generation, among folks who are dealing with student debt, and we know the racial disparities therein, the more likely we have a fighting chance at actually changing things, because our system was built on a set of assumptions, and a generation that experienced fundamentally different things than this generation of borrowers and students, and families. The last thing I'll say is that I think, we've talked a lot about, Beverly in particular talked about, and Walter, the things that the state can do, right? And the whereas the state can focus on. I think we really need to have a push for both state and federal action on this. We know that this economic crisis and the pandemic has done a number on state budgets. And so states may be a little bit more constrained. And so there's, there really needs to be a push for federal action. One, insufficient stimulus bill was not enough. There desperately needs to be extra support for state and local governments to not just, address student debt, but address the fact that 1 in 3 Black renters in New Jersey is behind on debt payments, that, half of Black New Jersey residents, and I believe 3/4 of Hispanic or Latinx New Jersey residents have experienced a loss of income in the past 6 months. That's a situation that if it's not fixed is going to manifest itself in our student debt and the ability to pay it off and the amount of borrowing that happens in future generations. But it's a disaster for our economy. It's not investing in our people, and so there's a real need for both state and federal action on this. And again, you can't beat lived experience in terms of talking to policymakers, legislators, and so forth.
Yeah, key takeaway is, how do we continue to get this information that was shared here? I feel like I've learned a ton, but how do we get this information in the hands of the people who are now making the decision and our future borrowers? And so that is something that I'm going to be thinking about, and continuing to share the lived experiences and making sure that the policymakers and the advocates are seeing and hearing the story, and also we're finding new ways to share it with the folks who need it.
I'm going to close coming right to respond to Shannon's question about how do we deal with getting information out and serving the people that need to hear it. But I'm going to come at it a little bit weirdly, so bear with me for just a moment. There's a publication called New Jersey Biz, NJ Biz, comes out every month, and it features very, very wealthy people organizing and campaigning to reduce tax revenue into the state to make more of this situation occur. So there are more people who are broke, more people carrying huge debt loads. We need a different voice from a publication or a website, a common portal, maybe through the Institute, that is actually serving working people and people who are striving to build equity across the state. That kind of media outlet where we get to tell Shannon's story beyond a forum like this is tremendously useful. And we need to kind of meet the folks who are trying to make an argument for austerity across the state. Like, we cannot let them try and steer the next kind of legislative and election cycle. And then beyond that, I'll volunteer up front. I have a free resource that's titled Engine of Creation. It's basically a PDF that talks about a lot of these solutions in the chapter on economics. And so if you wanted to just go online and download the free PDF, it's like a synopsis of what I was talking about tonight. So I think we need more like that. I'm trying to come out with another one in the next few weeks, but Engine of Creation is available right now.
So this is absolutely wonderful. There is so much wisdom and experience here. So fora like this need to be recreated, and we need to figure out other ways to get this information accessible and across. Over decades, this private higher education financing regime has been constructed by individuals, by institutional interests, and the people are not at the heart of this. And I think the society is finally beginning to slowly wake up to what student debt is about, how enormous it is, and who it impacts, and who it harms greatly. Lastly, I do think with hopefully the next president, our job becomes, there will be, I'm convinced, legislation or something on student debt forgiveness. It is our job to make sure that it is broad, robust, and that race is centered in a progressive way. And that's I think is the movement, the struggle ahead of us. And I'm glad to see several folks whose faces I can see, and I'm sure lots in the audience that's going to help make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us. We know that resolving the student debt crisis and ultimately closing the racial wealth gap requires actionable change. So we hope that this conversation was helpful in highlighting what we can do, each of us, to take action. I think that we've gotten really good insights, and it's going to carry us through as we continue to do advocacy and really show people how they can continue to mobilize within their own communities. And that's why that 10 things document, which highlights things like a possible guaranteed income program in your city, or we'll explore the impact of a reparations task force, which will be helmed with thinking about these issues and thinking about what it means to really invest in communities, something that needs to be done more in New Jersey as we deal with this crisis. The Institute's student loan work is part of an ongoing effort to repair harm in the state, and we'll hope that everyone on this call will be involved. Please continue supporting the Institute and our intersecting areas of work. We hope you'll again read and share the 10 things document that we've discussed throughout. And we also are encouraging all of our panelists, as well as all of our attendees, to tune into Zoom or Facebook Live next Thursday for registration, restoration, reparations, voting as power during a pandemic, where members of our team will be joined by people who just had their voting rights restored, as well as Senator Cory Booker, to discuss how voting will work in New Jersey and why it's so important to get it right so that we can harness our power. If you're currently watching us on Facebook, consider following the Institute on other social media platforms. On Twitter, we are NJ_ISJ, and Do Social Justice on Instagram. And lastly, please visit our website to sign up for updates and donate to support our mission to do social justice from the ground up in the Garden State. And bear in mind that doing this important work of economic justice, especially during this time when we're thinking about what it means to rebuild our foundation, when we're looking at the earthquakes that have been caused by COVID-19 and really how they've only helped to amplify the issues that Black and Brown borrowers and really Black and Brown people are facing in the state. We hope that you will all go forward and help us to continue to do this work from the ground up, incorporating community members and local voices into all of our action. Thank you. And again, a huge thank you to our panelists who helped make this event such a success. We've had lots of viewers on Zoom and Facebook. I truly appreciate all of your efforts. So thank you to all of our viewers, and I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you.